Manifest destiny was the idea that God had decreed that white settlers would and should conquer and settle the American continent, no matter what terrible measure they needed to take to do so, up to and including genocide. Here's the messed up truth of manifest destiny. The basic idea behind manifest destiny is that some divine imperative gives one group of people the right or mandate to conquer another and take their land. And this is an idea that obviously predates America. In fact, who's to say that Homo sapiens weren't all like, God hath ordained we take these caves away from the Neanderthal guys? Obviously, written history doesn't go back that far, but the British were manifest destiny all over the world before America was doing it, and so was most of Europe. And it's not like Americans woke up one day and said to themselves, we should own North America. That was pretty much a given when the first European settlers decided to move into the indigenous people's backyard. Of course, people had to come up with justifications as to why it was proper for them to kill other people and take their stuff. That's when God, or some kind of philosophical proxy for God, came in. And it was happening in America long before the term manifest destiny was created. In 1818, for instance, future President Andrew Jackson led a brutal attack against escaped slaves and Seminoles in Florida because they supposedly threatened a group of white settlers who had illegally seized land in Florida, which wasn't even a part of the United States yet, as it was owned by Spain at the time. Americans were okay with it, though, because they apparently felt that Florida should be theirs by right. It was the first taste of the imperialist expansion of white supremacy that would become known as manifest destiny. Once Jackson became president, racism basically became federal policy. He was the man behind the Indian Removal Act, which was so racist no one even bothered to come up with a not racist name for it. In an 1830 speech, he said, "What good man would prefer a country covered with forest and ranged by a few thousand savages to our extensive republic, studded with cities, towns, and prosperous farms, embellished with all the improvements which art can devise or industry execute, occupied by more than 12 million happy people, and filled with all the blessings of liberty, civilization, and religion?" According to the Library of Congress, the Indian Removal Act, enacted 15 years before the term manifest destiny was even a thing, basically just made it legal for Jackson to seize indigenous lands that were within state borders and force their occupants to move west into unsettled territories which they'd never seen and were going to have to leave in a few years anyway, as land-hungry Americans decided to go west in search of even better lands to steal. The most infamous resettlement that happened under the auspices of the Indian Removal Act was the Trail of Tears, a forcible march to new lands that cost thousands of native lives. The first guy to use the phrase manifest destiny didn't set out to coin a racist slogan. He was just trying to justify the American annexation of yet another foreign land that settlers had appropriated for themselves, this time Texas. In 1845, political magazine editor John L. O'Sullivan wrote a screed decrying interference by England and France, who he bemoaned were thwarting our policy and hampering our power, limiting our greatness, and checking the fulfillment of our manifest destiny to overspread the continent allotted by Providence for the free development of our yearly multiplying millions. People liked it, so he wrote a second one, this time adding in some language about the importance of spreading democracy throughout the world, this time espousing the right of our manifest destiny to overspread and to possess the whole of the continent, which Providence has given us for the development of the great experiment of liberty and federated self-government entrusted to us. In other words, Americans were just making the world safe for democracy, which would also become a common justification for American expansion and military action. In order to make yourself feel okay about all of that manifest destiny, you had to build up a fake moral framework around it. So that's what Americans did. First of all, they declared that America was virtuous, its people were extra super virtuous, and its laws and institutions were especially virtuous, and therefore it was America's obligation to remake the rest of the world in its own image, starting with the people who were here first. According to the Black Hawk Museum, Americans wanted to redeem the sins of the old world. You know, the tyranny of kings, the brutal wars, that stuff, by building a better world in the new world, even if building it meant the wholesale slaughter and displacement of the native population. But the major driving force behind Manifest Destiny was the destiny part, the belief that no one could change the trajectory of white occupation of the New World because it was a duty assigned to America by God. And this logic didn't just excuse bad behavior, it demanded it. Because if you weren't doing your part to take over the lands in the New World and subjugate the indigenous population, well, that was an affront to God. And many missionaries and educators took that very seriously, turning it into a philosophical notion called the white man's burden. This was the idea that white Europeans had a duty to bring civilization and Christian enlightenment to the supposedly uncivilized, heathen populations of the world for their own good, whether they liked it or not. Still, no matter how much people dressed it up with religion or feigned altruism, there's no denying what the fundamental roots of Manifest Destiny actually were. It was all about white people taking everyone else's stuff and not being held accountable for it. According to the National Humanities Center, during the heyday of Manifest Destiny, there were clear racial lines drawn between the haves, the have-nots, and the shouldn't-haves. Native Americans could not claim permanent possession of any land on the North American continent, even though it literally belonged to them. Other non-whites couldn't claim possession of land either. And if natives and other non-whites couldn't claim the land, and you can do the math, the only people who could claim it were white Americans. Though this period has been romanticized in pop culture, it was at its heart white supremacy in its pure, unadulterated form, a belief that non-whites couldn't be trusted with land ownership, and therefore only whites could become stewards of the land as God intended. Not everyone was on board with Manifest Destiny. Indeed, there were plenty of prominent people who tried to stand up to expansionism. For instance, according to the Black Hawk Museum, prominent Americans like Abraham Lincoln and Ulysses Grant opposed the idea of Manifest Destiny. So did the Whig political party, and later opponents included Mark Twain and President Grover Cleveland. Long before he became president, Lincoln was opposed to the Mexican-American War largely because he thought it was an excuse for the United States to conquer new territories. He was right, but he didn't have the power yet to effect change, while then President James K. Polk enjoyed wide support. Objections to the war and further expansion failed. More than 1,700 Americans were killed in action during the Mexican-American War, along with an estimated 25,000 Mexicans who were killed or wounded. And those totals don't count the more than 13,000 Americans who died from disease during the war. But the death toll was only the start of the long-term consequences of the Mexican-American War. When America annexed Texas in 1845, it became clear that the United States could successfully take land away from other claimants, and there was nothing anyone could do about it, which opened up the rest of the continent for settlement by American citizens. Meanwhile, people were on wagon trains to Oregon, where they'd been promised land that could be cultivated year-round. At first, the indigenous people who lived along the Oregon Trail were tolerant to the invaders, even seeing the wagons as an opportunity for trade. Occasionally, the natives killed pioneers, but not as often as the pioneers killed natives. But as more and more settlers headed west, there was less and less land available to share. To make room for new arrivals, someone had to be pushed out, and we all know who that would be. It's pretty hard to argue against slavery when you're in favor of genocide, so naturally, Manifest Destiny went hand in hand with slavery. Not only was Manifest Destiny racism and genocide that was coded into law, but the westward expansion that was being done in its name made some people wonder if they wouldn't need to bring slaves with them to wash the camp dishes and make the beds and feed the horses. Because all that stuff was just too hard to do when you've been sitting in a wagon all day. Besides leading to the annexation of a bunch of indigenous lands, the Mexican-American War also helped promote the idea of the expansion of slavery. The northern and southern states disagreed about whether or not slaves should accompany settlers into the new territories, though. The Missouri Compromise of 1820 stipulated that slavery would be legal south of the 36.5 parallel, stretching as far west as the country could go. So slavery expanded into the southwest, but not the northwest. Tensions created during this ideological disagreement was a major contributing factor to the American Civil War. The original justification for Manifest Destiny was that America was destined to command the entire North American continent. By 1860, that had been accomplished, and by the 1870s, the transcontinental railroad spanned the whole nation. So you might have thought that Manifest Destiny and expansionist imperialism would have ended there, but you'd be very wrong. The driving force this time, not God, but capitalism. After all, there was money to be made by exploiting new resources, new cheap labor forces, and new markets, preferably all three at once, which is how America ended up conquering the sovereign nation of Hawaii through the force of private enterprise. Sugarcane and pineapples were just two of the hot commodities produced in Hawaii, and the American oligarchs who controlled production wanted more control and more profits. In 1887, a group of rich white businessmen formed an armed militia that forced Hawaii's king to sign a new constitution that they had drawn up, which stripped him of power and gave it to American business interests. When the king died, though, his successor queen, Liliuokalani, attempted to assert Hawaiian independence. In 1893, the Americans turned to the U.S. military for support, and the U.S. ambassador sent a force of Marines to strong-arm the queen into abdicating. President Grover Cleveland, who opposed Manifest Destiny, ruled the overthrow illegal and demanded that the American businessmen return the queen to power. However, in 1896, the pro-imperialist William McKinley was elected president, and 2 years later, America annexed Hawaii, shortly before conquering the Philippines as well. Today, almost everyone is very aware of how epically crappy the whole Manifest Destiny thing is. Fortunately, America is mostly done capturing territory and expanding its borders. But many of the people who were displaced by the policy are still suffering. According to the African American Policy Forum, hundreds of thousands of indigenous Americans were forced onto reservations where they were isolated, stripped of their traditions, and denied their rights. In most cases, they couldn't hunt or gather food the way they once had, due to being given the worst land around, so they were forced to adopt the European system of employment. But their isolation kept unemployment numbers high and income levels low. As a result, alcoholism in Native American communities is disproportionately high, and so is morbidity, mortality, and disease. These conditions persist today because it's the end result of a long tradition of broken treaties, lies, and genocide, all perpetuated by the concept of Manifest Destiny. On a broader level, Manifest Destiny has evolved from physical expansion to cultural expansion. Today, Manifest Destiny is a political ideal, as many Americans believe that American-style capitalism and American-style democracy are a one-size-fits-all solution to all of the world's problems. And the biggest way in which America now conquers people isn't through violence or seizing lands, but by changing hearts and minds through what some people call cultural imperialism. American products are sold worldwide through American stores and restaurants that can be found everywhere, while American movies and music play in movie theaters, over the airways, and through computer screens in every corner of the globe. At its core, Manifest Destiny was about reshaping the world in America's image. And by that metric, Manifest Destiny has been more successful than anyone in the 19th century could possibly have imagined. Check out one of our newest videos right here. Plus, even more grunge videos about your favorite stuff are coming soon. Subscribe to our YouTube channel and hit the bell so you don't miss a single one.